The deed felt heavier than paper ought to. It wasn't just ink and seal anymore. It was every coin Boon Whitmore had scraped together, every mile of trail dust on his boots, every dream of silence after years of living in towns that never left a man in peace. He had imagined stepping down into this yard with nothing but the wind to greet him. Imagined the quiet creak of an empty porch and the smell of raw earth waiting for his plow. He had pictured solitude, the kind that pressed in from every side, like the horizon itself. And he had believed that solitude would heal him. But the picture cracked the instant he saw them. 3 women stood on the porch like statues, carved out of cedar and muscle, shadows stretching across the boards as if they already owned the setting sun. They didn't fidget. They didn't look surprised. They just watched him, their stillness a kind of power all its own. Boon halted in the yard, one hand resting on the horn of his saddle. His horse shifted beneath him, catching his unease, ears twitching toward the figures. The tallest woman stepped forward. She had shoulders like a blacksmith, and her smile carried no warmth, only the sharpness of someone used to deciding how a room would turn. Her eyes were a hard, cold blue, and the way they fixed on him made his stomach tighten. "You must be the new owner," she said. Her voice carried across the yard, steady as stone, low enough to sound almost like a man's, but edged with something older, something that didn't yield. Boon's grip on the deed tightened. For 3 days he had traveled here through rough country, sleeping under cold stars, pushing himself forward with the thought that once he reached the end, he could finally rest. He'd built this dream in his head with the care of a carpenter. Wood beams, cattle in the field, no voices but his own. And now 3 strangers stood where his dream should have been, breaking it apart before it even took its first breath. He forced his voice into something even, though his heart thudded too loud in his chest. "Ladies, I think there's been some confusion. This is my property now. I've got the legal documents right here." He held the deed up like a shield. The paper shook just enough for him to feel exposed. The other 2 women moved then, flanking the tall one. Both were just as broad-shouldered, just as strong in their stillness. One had a mass of dark hair braided back tight, her jaw square, her arms folded like she was measuring him. The third, red hair catching the last light, let out a laugh that sat too low, too certain, as if she already knew where this conversation was headed. Boon felt the isolation he had longed for twist against him now, turning sharp. Out here, 3 days' ride from the nearest sheriff, the law was a rumor at best. He had thought that remoteness would mean safety, but now it meant no witness, no help. The tall one's smile deepened, but it wasn't friendly. "Oh, we know exactly who you are, Boon Whitmore. We've been expecting you." The way she said his name froze him in place. Expecting him? How? He hadn't told a soul outside the cellar. The man had insisted on privacy, insisted no one needed to know who was taking over the property. Yet here they stood, not just aware, but waiting. The second woman, the one with dark hair, finally spoke. Her voice was deeper still, like river stones turned in current. "We've been living here for some time, taking care of the land, keeping it warm." The last word landed strange, almost mocking. Boone swallowed, shifting his weight in the saddle. The redhead leaned against the porch post, freckles catching light across her shoulders. The previous owner made certain arrangements before he left. Arrangements that don't vanish because you carry a piece of paper. The deed in Boone's hand suddenly felt fragile, less a guarantee than a trap set with his own money. He thought of the seller's eagerness, how quickly the man had shoved the deal through. Too quickly. Almost like he'd been desperate to pass something on before it collapsed. Boone's throat went dry. His dream of a clean start was dissolving into something else, something tangled and dangerous. The three women watched him with the quiet intensity of predators waiting to see which way he'd bolt. He wanted to laugh it off, to tell them this was nonsense, but there was no humor in their eyes. Only calculation. And beneath it, something he couldn't quite name. Something closer to hunger than anger. His hand drifted unconsciously toward the rifle strapped to his saddle. He didn't mean to, but instinct carried him there, the way a man's fingers might brush against a knife when walking through a dark alley. The tall woman's gaze followed the motion, unblinking. For the first time, her smile faltered just enough to reveal the weight of what hung between them. Boone realized then that this was no misunderstanding. He had stepped into the middle of something carefully laid, a web spun long before his arrival, his life savings, his fresh start. Everything hung in the balance of what these women wanted. And from the look in their eyes, what they wanted wasn't land alone. The silence pressed in. Boone's horse shifted nervously, snorting, as if it, too, could sense the storm circling. Boone forced his hand away from the rifle, breathing slow, trying to ground himself. He had to find footing, had to press for answers. "Ladies," he said, his voice rougher now, stripped of courtesy. "What exactly are you saying?" The tall woman's smile returned, sharp as a blade slipping free of its sheath. "We're saying, Boon Whitmore," she said, stepping down from the porch plank by plank, each footfall deliberate, "that Marcus Vance might have sold you the land. But he sold us something else entirely. And that includes you." The woman's boots thudded against the steps as she came down from the porch. And Boone realized she was taller than he'd guessed. The kind of tall that made a man straighten without meaning to, just to feel less small. She didn't reach for a weapon, didn't need to. The way she carried herself was weapon enough. "You've got papers," she said, nodding toward the deed, clutched in his fist. "But out here, paper doesn't keep you warm at night. Paper doesn't work the land. Paper doesn't pay the debts Marcus Vance left behind." Her words landed like stones in his gut. Marcus Vance. The name came too sharp, too sure. That was the seller, though he'd introduced himself only as Mark. A man eager to make a quick deal and vanish. Boone's blood chilled as he wondered how much these women knew about his business, or about him. The second woman, the one with the dark braid, unfolded her arms and stepped closer. "We've been keeping this place alive since Marcus turned tail. Building the soil, tending stock, making trade runs. Without us, this land would be dust and bones. He promised partnership, promised more than that." Her eyes narrowed, catching his like hooks. "Then he left us holding the weight of it all." The redhead chuckled again, low and dangerous. "And now you come walking in thinking you're free of those promises. That's not how it works, Boone." She rolled his name on her tongue, as if testing how it fit. "The contract doesn't vanish just because one man runs and another pays coin." Boone sat rigid in the saddle, his hand aching from the grip he had on the deed. He wanted to shout, to tell them none of this had anything to do with him, but the words stuck. Every instinct told him that denial would only tighten the noose. He tried steadiness instead. "Whatever Marcus promised you, I had no part in it. I bought this land fair and legal." The tall woman's smile cracked into something sharper. "Legal? she repeated, almost like it was a joke. You think a sheriff 3 days' ride from here will ride out to protect your fine seal and signature? Out here, law is who stands their ground and who yields. The truth in her voice hollowed his chest. She wasn't bluffing. There wasn't a soul within earshot to side with him if matters turned ugly. Still, he made himself swing down from the horse, boots crunching on the yard. If he looked like he was ready to flee, he'd already lost. He kept the rifle strapped to the saddle where it was. Deliberate, calm. My name is Boon Whitmore, he said firmly, grounding himself in the words. I paid for this land in good faith, and I'll work it in good faith. The dark-haired one circled slightly to his left, her movements fluid as a panther's, yet her eyes weren't cruel. They carried something quieter, almost tired. Good faith, she said, as if tasting the words. Marcus used those once, too, until they soured Magdalene, the redhead. Shifted down the steps, her boots heavy in the dirt. She drew a folded paper from her pocket and held it out, but not close enough for him to take without stepping nearer. You want to talk about contracts? Then look at this. Boone hesitated. The seal at the bottom, even from a distance, looked official. Real enough to tangle any man in doubt, eh? What is it? He asked, his voice careful. Marcus's promises, she said flatly. Written and signed. Obligations that fall to whoever takes his place. You? The yard seemed to shrink, the air pressing in. Boone's pulse hammered in his temples. He'd come here with visions of solitude, of shaping a new life with his own hands. Now he stood surrounded by 3 strangers, claiming rights over him, over the land, over everything he thought he'd purchased free and clear. Papers don't make me beholden to you, he forced out. Not like this. The tall one tilted her head, studying him with unsettling patience. Then tell me, Boon Whitmore, what exactly do you think you've bought? A house without hands to maintain it, a field without labor to tend it, a dream without anyone to keep it alive but you alone? Her words struck deeper than he wanted them to. He told himself isolation would heal him. But standing here, ringed by their unflinching gazes, he felt something he hadn't expected, an ache of loneliness sharper than the fear. The redhead stepped closer, green eyes fierce. Marcus didn't just promise us work. He promised us partnership, promised us companionship. Those promises don't vanish with his shadow. They fall to you now. The meaning pressed in on him. He wanted to recoil, but something in their faces stopped him. Beneath the force and the threat, he caught glimpses of something else. Hurt, betrayal, longing twisted into defiance. For the first time since he'd ridden into the yard, Boone's fear tangled with another feeling he didn't know how to name. These weren't simple squatters. They were women wronged, cornered, and determined never to be left behind again. Get it? The silence stretched, thick as a storm cloud. His throat worked as he fought to steady his breath. He had to know more, had to understand what Marcus had left behind before he could decide whether to fight or to listen. Show me, Boone said finally, his voice low but steady. Show me what Marcus promised you. The women exchanged a glance, their unity silent and unnerving. Helena, the tall one, nodded once. Then you'd better brace yourself. Because Marcus Vance left more than empty land behind the paper, Magdalene held fluttered in the faint wind, thick parchment with a seal pressed into the corner. Boone forced himself to step closer, boots sinking into the dirt as though the ground itself wanted to slow him. Every part of him screamed caution, but he couldn't turn away. If he rode off now, he'd always wonder what snare Marcus Vance had left behind. Magdalene unfolded the document with deliberate care, her freckled, hands steady, almost ceremonial. "Read it," she said, and though her voice was sharp, her eyes betrayed something else. Anger, yes, but under it, the raw edge of betrayal. Boon took the paper. His heart sank at the first lines. Marcus's handwriting. He recognized it from the bill of sale. The words slid across the page in legal phrasing that disguised their intent. Partnership in farming operations, equal division of profits, mutual support, and companionship for all parties involved. He stopped, jaw tight. Companionship. The word leapt from the page like a snake in the grass. "That's not a contract," Boon said, his voice low. "That's a trick dressed up with ink." Ruth stepped forward now, her presence quieter but no less commanding. Her braid hung heavy over her shoulder, her face shadowed by the porch roof. Marcus was clever with words. Promises that sounded like love but were business. Promises that sounded like business but were love. We didn't see the trap until he was already halfway gone. Boone scanned further down, his stomach turning as he reached the closing clause. "This agreement shall extend to any successor in ownership of the property, binding them to fulfill the obligations herein." Marcus had done it deliberately. He hadn't just abandoned them, he'd sold them along with the land, making his exit cleaner while leaving the mess for another man to inherit. Boone let out a slow breath. "No court would honor this," Helena's voice answered, calm but cutting. "Who said anything about courts?" She stood a few feet away, her arms crossed over her chest, the size of her frame casting him in shadow. "Law doesn't stretch this far. Out here, honor is the only ink that binds. Marcus owed us more than coin. He owed us trust, a future. And when he fled, he promised the next man would carry the weight." Boone looked up from the paper into Helena's eyes. There was no bluff in them, no wild hysteria, just certainty, steady as a hammer striking an anvil. Something in Boone cracked then, not from fear, but from the way her voice trembled just enough when she said trust. For all her size, for all the iron she carried in her posture, there was a wound there, a hollow left by a man who had smiled, promised, then fled. Magdalene's hand brushed the parchment where he still held it. "He took advantage of us, our labor, our beds, our hearts. We gave him everything, and he gave us paper cuts and empty fields." Was her voice roughened, and she swallowed hard before looking away. Ruth's gaze lingered on Boone, unflinching. "Do you see now why your claim feels like theft to us? You think you bought soil and timber. What we hear is Marcus selling us a second time." Boone's chest tightened. He thought of the seller's hurried manner, his refusal to linger once the coins had changed hands. Marcus Vance hadn't just tricked him, he'd weaponized him, sent him walking blind into a nest of grief and fury. Boone wanted to throw the paper in the dirt, to shout that he owed them nothing, that their quarrel was with Marcus alone. But when he looked at them, Helena's rigid stance, Ruth's searching eyes, Magdalene's smoldering hurt, he saw more than threats. He saw three people trying to hold together what was left of themselves. "I didn't sign this," Boone said at last, though his tone softened against his will. "I can't be chained to promises I never made." Helena's jaw flexed. For a long moment she said nothing, and the silence cut deeper than anger. When she finally spoke, her voice had shifted, carrying a faint tremor that surprised him. "Legally, maybe you're right, but morally, we're left with nothing. No justice, no man to answer for the months he took from us, and no future, unless someone honors what he ran from. The words lodged under Boon's ribs. He felt them in a place deeper than reason. He'd come here searching for solitude, yet standing among them, the ache in their voices mirrored his own buried loneliness. He understood too well what it meant to build your life around someone who didn't stay. His mind raced, caught between the pull of compassion and the sting of being trapped in someone else's scheme. Marcus's shadow stretched long across the yard, binding them all in its reach. Boon folded the paper carefully, returning it to Magdalene. "If Marcus betrayed you," he said slowly, "then I reckon he betrayed me too. Seems we've all got his ghost on our backs for the first time." Helena's stern mask cracked. The faintest flicker of something raw passed through her blue eyes. Relief, maybe, or sorrow. Ruth shifted closer, her voice quiet but firm. "Then don't turn your back like he did. You don't have to honor every word, Boon. Just don't leave us standing in the ruins." The plea in her tone struck him harder than any threat had. He drew in a breath, heavy with dust and uncertainty. He didn't know what future they were dragging him toward. But he knew this much. Marcus Vance had tied their fates together, whether he liked it or not. And as Boon looked at them again, he realized he was no longer just measuring his land. He was measuring the weight of their scars. The parchment had gone back into Magdalene's pocket, but its weight lingered in the air, as though it still hovered between them. Boon stood in the yard, shoulders stiff, the last rays of sunlight stretching long shadows over his boots. He wanted to call it all a sham, to harden his voice and shove the women aside with words sharp enough to cut the tension in two. But the longer he held their gazes, the harder it became to pretend this was only business. Helena was the first to break the silence. She no longer looked like the giant sentinel who had met him with cold eyes on the porch. Her arms loosened at her sides, and her jaw, which had been set like stone, trembled just slightly. "Marcus came here full of fire," she said, her voice lower now, almost hushed. "Talked about building something from the ground up. Said he wanted partners, not servants. Told us we were more than labor, told us we were the foundation." She drew a slow breath, steadying herself. "And for a while, I believed him." Ruth's gaze slipped down to her hands, fingers twining in and out of each other. "He made us promises in the evenings after the work was done. Spoke of futures like they were sure things. Spoke of us like we mattered. It wasn't the land he betrayed us with, Boon. It was..." She paused, searching for a word, her voice nearly breaking. "It was the way he made us feel seen." Magdalene barked a laugh, but it was jagged, bitter. "And when he got bored, he left us with dirt under our nails, debts in our names, and a piece of paper binding us to nothing but his shadow." She lifted her chin defiantly, but her green eyes betrayed a raw shine. "We weren't just fooled. We were left empty-handed after giving more than any man had a right to ask." Boon felt his throat tighten. He had expected swindlers or squatters, women who thrived on threats. Instead, what stood before him were three betrayed souls. Their power and hardness, a shell built over hurt too deep to name. For a long moment, he couldn't speak. He remembered nights of his own, staring into coal hearths after losing what he'd thought would never leave. He remembered the hollow ache of absence, the kind that clawed at a man's chest until it felt like there was less of him left each morning. Then their pain was different in shape, but not in weight. He recognized it. Helena caught his silence, her eyes narrowing as if bracing for dismissal. "You think us fools, don't you? Women too quick to believe a silver tongue. But you don't know how it feels, Whitmore, to break your back alongside someone and let yourself hope he might stay. Out here, hope is rarer than water. Her words struck him harder than accusation. He wanted to deny it, to keep distance between their scars and his own, but he couldn't. "I don't think you're fools," Boon said quietly. His voice surprised even him. "I think Marcus was a coward. And cowards always leave someone else to carry their debts." "Zell?" The redhead's laugh softened into something closer to a sob, though she caught it quickly, biting it back. Ruth's head lifted, eyes glistening but steady. Helena's lips pressed together, her strength bending under the weight of memory. They stood there, 4 people tethered by a man no longer present, the dust of his betrayal still clinging to them all. Boon shifted, his boots crunching in the dirt. "I came here looking for silence," he admitted. "But silence looks different when it's filled with someone else's ghosts." Ruth studied him then, her voice low but certain. "We're not asking you to take Marcus's place in every way. Only not to turn your back like he did her." Words carried no edge, no demand. Just a plea carved from weariness. Boon's chest ached at the honesty. He could see in Ruth's eyes the desperate hope that he might be different, and in Magdalene's tight jaw the fear of being fooled again. Helena tried to hold her mask of steel, but even she could not hide the fracture lines Marcus had left behind. The air between them was no longer charged with threat alone. It was heavy with something far more dangerous, vulnerability. And it pulled at Boon in ways he wasn't prepared for. He looked toward the house, its porch worn but sturdy, its windows glowing faintly as dusk deepened. He thought of the life he had pictured, solitary meals, the creak of an empty chair, the sound of nothing but his own breath in the dark. It had seemed like peace before. Now, compared to the raw humanity standing before him, it felt like a tomb. "I don't know what Marcus promised you," Boon said, his voice thick, "but I know this much. I'm not him, and I won't pretend to be." Helena's eyes locked on his, searching, testing. Slowly, the corners of her mouth lifted, not in mockery this time, but in something closer to relief. "Then maybe that's what we needed to hear," she said. Magdalene wiped quickly at her cheek, pretending it was only dust. Ruth let out a breath she had been holding too long. The sun sank fully then, leaving them in the quiet of twilight, the yard wrapped in the hush of night coming on. For the first time since his arrival, the silence didn't feel like a trap. It felt like the opening of something uncertain, fragile and real. Boon stood a little straighter, the weight of the deed still in his pocket, but feeling less like ownership and more like responsibility. He didn't know yet what role he would play in their lives, but one truth settled heavy in his bones. He couldn't walk away. Not now, not after seeing what lay beneath their threats. And as the stars began to blink into the night sky, Boon realized the danger before him wasn't only losing his land. It was losing himself to the pull of 3 wounded hearts, bound together by survival, and perhaps by something that could outlast betrayal. The night pressed closer, thick with the smell of dust and cattle and the faint sweetness of lavender that clung to Helena's skin. The porch loomed behind them, the same place Boon had first seen the 3 women as sentinels. Yet something had shifted. They were no longer statues carved from defiance. They were flesh and bone, scarred by betrayal, standing in the same raw air he breathed. Ruth was the first to speak. Her voice was soft, but each word struck with precision. "We don't want another Marcus, Boon. We're not asking you to be him. We're asking if you can imagine something different, something we tried to build once but never finished." Boone's hand drifted to the deed in his pocket, its edges rough against his fingertips. He had come here with a vision, carved simple as stone: solitude, cattle, quiet work. Yet their words were tugging at him, pulling threads loose until his vision frayed. He looked at each of them in turn, their faces caught in the half-light. Helena with her cold blue eyes that hid loneliness like a locked chest. Ruth, steady and calm, though her hands still trembled from memory. And Magdalene, fierce and fiery, her defiance a shield barely holding against hurt. Helena stepped forward then, her size no longer a threat but a force of certainty. "We're proposing a real partnership," she said, her tone slow, deliberate, as if building the frame of a house. Not the hollow arrangement Marcus offered. Not promises he never meant to keep. We work this land together. We share the profits. We share the labor. She paused, her gaze steady on Boone. And we share our lives. The last words fell heavy like an axe striking oak. Boone's pulse quickened, though he stood motionless. He wanted to scoff, to say it was absurd. 3 women and 1 man bound together not only by work, but by choice. Yet the silence that followed left him with no ground to laugh from. The sincerity in her voice cut too deep. Magdalene broke the silence, her freckles catching moonlight as she stepped nearer. "It sounds wild, I know. But out here, rules are what you make of them. We don't have society's eyes on us telling us what's proper. We have only ourselves and what we choose." Her green eyes burned into his, fierce but pleading. "We chose not to let Marcus's betrayal break us. We chose each other, and now..." She drew in a breath, steadying her words. "Now we're choosing to ask if you'll stand with us, not above us, not against us." With us, Boone's throat worked. He looked away, out toward the shadowed fields. The land stretched wide, open, waiting. He had dreamed of filling it with cattle, with labor that would quiet the noise inside him. But now he wondered if the land itself had been waiting for something else entirely, for this strange proposal that defied every rule he had carried with him. Ruth's voice slipped into the stillness, quieter than the others, but carrying the weight of truth. "We're not offering seduction, Boone. We're offering survival, yes, but also companionship, the kind that grows from trust, not tricks. You've seen what Marcus left us. We don't want to beg, and we won't be beggars. But we can't keep this place alive alone. And maybe none of us want to deep down." Her words struck him hardest of all, for in them he heard his own reflection, the ache of solitude he had carried for years, the quiet fear that his life might stretch on, empty until the end. He dragged a hand down his face, the roughness of his palm grounding him. 3 women, asking a stranger to join them, he muttered half to himself. In business. In life. Most folks wouldn't believe it. Helena's lips curved, not mocking but steady. Most folks don't live out here. And we're not asking most folks. We're asking you. Boone's chest tightened. His mind screamed caution, warning of traps and ruin, but something deeper whispered another truth, that what they offered was not just a burden, but a chance to belong to something greater than himself, greater than the deed folded in his pocket. He met Helena's gaze, then Ruth's, then Magdalene's. Each pair of eyes held expectation, but also fear. They were strong, but strength born of necessity, not unbreakable steel. They needed him. And though he wouldn't yet admit it out loud, he needed them too. Finally, Boone spoke, his voice rough as gravel. "If I even considered this, I'd need to know what I'm stepping into. I'd need to see what you've built, what you fought to keep alive. Helena's shoulders eased, though her eyes glistened faintly in the moonlight. Then you'll see it. You'll see every channel of water Ruth carved, every pasture we've mended, every trade route Magdalene fought to secure. Her voice steadied into something stronger. And maybe you'll see us for who we are, not just the women Marcus betrayed, but the partners we were always meant to be. Magdalene gave a small nod, her fire tempered by relief. Ruth's lips curved in the barest smile, weary but hopeful. Boon exhaled, long and unsteady. The night air felt different now, less like the bars of a cage and more like the open mouth of a canyon, wide and unknown. He didn't have his answer yet, not fully, but he knew one thing with certainty. His life would never return to the simple solitude he had planned. The choice standing before him was no longer about land or money. It was about whether he would dare to belong again. Dawn came slow and quiet, the kind of gray light that softens the world before the sun claims it. Boon hadn't slept much. He'd bedded down in the barn, more from habit than trust, his rifle laid across his knees as he leaned against the hay bales. But even in the restless hours, he kept turning over Helena's words, Magdalene's fire, Ruth's calm plea. They had asked for more than any man might give, yet they had asked with a weight that felt less like temptation and more like truth. When the rooster crowed and the chill of morning sank through the barn boards, Boon rose stiff and weary but resolved. If he was to judge their offer, he needed proof. He needed to see what this land was beneath Marcus's lies. Helena met him outside. She wore no smile, only the set of someone ready to show a stranger the sum of her sweat. You wanted to see, she said simply. Then you'll see. Ruth joined them, her braid coiled neatly, her face still holding the softness of morning. Magdalene came last, rolling up her sleeves, freckles bright against skin kissed red by the rising sun. Together, they led him out toward the fields. The ground underfoot was rough, dry in patches, but the further they walked, the more Boon noticed signs of deliberate labor. Fence posts cut square and hammered straight, troughs lined with stone, irrigation channels carved by steady hands. Ruth stopped at one of those channels, crouching to let her palm hover over the faint trickle of water flowing toward the garden plots. This spring was nothing more than a muddy seep when Marcus first saw it, she explained. Her voice carried no boast, only the pride of one who knew her worth. I mapped the slope, cut the channels myself, kept them lined with stone so they wouldn't collapse. It took weeks. Marcus bragged to traders it was his doing, but every inch of this water is mine. Boon crouched beside her, tracing the line of the channel with his eyes. The work was clean, practical, better than what most ranchers managed in a year. He let out a low whistle despite himself. You did this alone. Ruth lifted her chin, with Magdalene carrying a stone and Helena driving the spade when I couldn't lift another arm. Yes, alone enough. Her quiet certainty struck him harder than the sight of the water itself. This wasn't borrowed skill, it was lived grit. They moved on to the pastures where cattle grazed, lean but healthy. Fences stood straight, mended where storms had tried to tear them down. Magdalene strode ahead, gesturing towards the herd, with a hand calloused by rope burns. Marcus wanted numbers, not strength, she said. Bought thin stock cheap and pushed them hard. We traded them out one by one for animals worth the feed. It took months, but now the herd holds. And when the traders come through, they know this brand. She pointed to the mark on the cattle's hides, an M scorched into leather. Boon narrowed his eyes, recognizing its sharp edges. For Marcus?" he asked. Magdalene's mouth tightened. "It was. We're changing it. Haven't decided to what. Something that isn't his." The bitterness in her voice cut through the morning air. Boone looked over the herd again, healthy backs shining in the light, and felt the first stirrings of admiration. This was no ragtag squatters' camp. This was the work of people who had bent the land to their will and carved survival out of its rough edges. They walked further, to a chicken coop tucked against the barn. The smell of straw and feathers mixed with the faint warmth of fresh eggs. Ruth gathered two in her hands, offering them out as if to prove the point. "We keep trade routes alive with eggs, buttermilk," she said. 3 settlements ride through here. They know we're steady. Marcus left debts, but he also left our reputation. That part we claimed as our own." Helena lingered at the edge of the coop, her arms folded, her eyes fixed on Boone. "Do you see it now?" she asked, her voice carrying more weight than challenge. "This isn't a dream. It's a farm, it's a business, and it's a life, built with our hands, not his Boone. Let the silence stretch." He did see it. Every trough, every fence post, every patch of green fighting to rise from the hard soil bore their fingerprints. Marcus had sold him land, but these women had made it a living thing. His chest ached with the realization. He drew in a breath, steadying himself. "It's more than I expected," he admitted. His voice carried no flattery, only truth. "You've done work most men wouldn't shoulder." Magdalene's sharp mouth softened just a fraction. Ruth's lips curved in the faintest smile. Helena's shoulders eased, though her gaze never left his. They turned back toward the farmhouse, its frame rising sturdy against the lightening sky. Helena gestured toward it with a sweep of her arm. "The house has 4 rooms. We use 3. The 4th stayed empty." Her voice faltered just enough to carry a weight she didn't speak aloud. "We always knew someone would come. We just didn't expect Marcus to send another man instead of staying himself." Boone followed their gaze to the house. He imagined nights spent at that long table, meals shared, conversations lingering after work. He had wanted silence, but silence never cooked a meal, never mended a fence, never sat across from you with tired eyes that still held trust. As they climbed the porch steps again, Ruth's voice slipped into the quiet. "You asked what kind of partnership we meant. Now you've seen it." Boone's hand brushed the railing, the wood warm from their touch. He felt the pull in his chest grow stronger, impossible to ignore. The question was no longer whether the farm could sustain him. The question was whether he could sustain them, and whether he was willing to risk his heart on it. The house loomed larger up close than Boone had expected. Not for its size, it was modest. 4 rooms, as Helena had said, but for the way it carried the imprint of the people who lived there. The porch planks were worn smooth from use, the railings polished by hands, resting after long days, and the windows bore faint smudges of faces that had looked out into the yard, waiting, watching. When Helena pushed the door open, the air inside greeted him with warmth he hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just the hearth fire still glowing from the night before. It was the scent of bread lingering in the kitchen, the faint tang of soap, the orderliness of a space lived in with care. This wasn't an abandoned structure on the frontier. This was a home. Boone stepped cautiously into the sitting room, his boots landing on a braided rug that looked hand-woven, its edges frayed but sturdy. Chairs had been arranged in a circle around the hearth, not scattered, not careless, arranged for conversation. On the mantel above the fire, he noticed a row of small carved figures, animals, each one carefully whittled, their surfaces smoothed by touch. He didn't ask who had carved them, but something in him softened. This wasn't Marcus's house. It wasn't even his. Yet, it belonged to them, stitched together with the threads of survival and presence. Ruth moved past him, setting the eggs they'd gathered on the broad wooden counter of the kitchen. She tied on an apron with practiced ease and stoked the fire in the stove. "We make do with what we have," she said, glancing over her shoulder. "Sometimes that's beans, sometimes it's better, but no one leaves the table hungry." Magdalene leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, her freckles bright against the pale morning light streaming through the window. "We built this place for us, Boon. Marcus never sat here long enough to leave a mark. Whatever you see, it's ours." Boon ran his fingers along the back of one of the chairs, the wood smooth from use. He felt something stir inside him, an ache he hadn't expected. For years, meals had been solitary affairs, the scrape of his fork against tin, the only sound in a room too empty to echo. Here, the table spoke of laughter, of quarrels, of comfort drawn from simple togetherness. Helena stood by the doorway, her massive frame filling it, yet her voice came quieter than before. "We never wanted to be just laborers in a man's house. We wanted to build something of our own." Marcus dangled that dream in front of us, then snatched it away. But we stayed, because leaving would have meant losing each other. Boon looked at her then, really looked. For all her size and strength, her eyes betrayed weariness, the kind that seeps into a person's bones when they've carried more than their share for too long. He thought of her words the night before. "Out here, hope is rarer than water." He understood them better now. They moved into the kitchen as Ruth cracked eggs into a pan, the smell rising to fill the air. Boon sat at the edge of the table, his posture uncertain, as though he were trespassing on sacred ground, but none of them pushed him out. Magdalene fetched mugs and filled them from a pot of coffee, simmering on the stove. She set one in front of him, her movements brusque but not unkind. "Drink. You look like a man who's been running on dust." He lifted the mug, the warmth seeping into his hands. The bitter taste was stronger than what he was used to, but it was grounding. He found himself relaxing, if only slightly. The three women moved around the kitchen with a rhythm practiced and seamless. Ruth stirred, Helena fetched, Magdalene poured. They brushed past one another without colliding, without words, as though the space itself had been built to hold them. Boon watched, realizing he was seeing something rare. Partnership not spoken of in contracts, but lived in gestures and glances. Ruth slid the pan onto the table, eggs steaming, bread set alongside. Helena sat heavily in a chair, Magdalene across from her, Ruth last. For a moment, they all looked at Boon as if to say, "This is the test. Will you sit with us, or will you stand apart?" Boon hesitated only a breath before lowering himself into the empty chair. The scrape of wood against floor sounded louder than it should have. His chest tightened with something he hadn't felt in years, belonging, faint but real. They ate quietly at first. Then Ruth asked him about his old life, her tone careful. Boon spoke little. His words clipped, but they listened without pressing. Magdalene told a story about a stubborn cow that refused to be milked until Ruth sang to it, her voice carrying a spark of humor that softened her hard edges. Even Helena allowed a chuckle, low and rare, that made Boon glance at her in surprise. For the first time since he'd set foot on the property, the tension eased. The farmhouse wrapped around him like a quilt, stitched from scars and persistence. When the meal ended, Ruth gathered the plates. "You don't have to give us an answer today," she said, her voice steady. "But now you've seen how we live, not just how we work. If you stay, it'll be as part of this, not above it, not apart from it." Boon looked around the room. The hearth, the carved figures, the worn table bearing marks of years of meals. His throat tightened as he realized how hollow his dream of solitude suddenly felt beside the weight of this home. He pushed his chair back slowly, the decision not yet made, but already shifting inside him. "I'll think on it," he said. But deep down, he knew thinking was only a formality. The house had already begun its work on him. Evening settled thick over the farmhouse, the air cooling into the kind of quiet that carries every sound. Crickets had begun their chorus in the grass, and the cattle lowed softly in the distance. Boon sat at the table with the three women, the remnants of supper cleared away, the lamplight throwing soft golden circles over their faces. For the first time since his arrival, the tension between them had softened into something nearly comfortable. Helena leaned back in her chair, one strong arm resting across the table. Ruth's hands moved steadily as she dried the last plate with a cloth, while Magdalene leaned against the mantel, arms crossed, eyes restless. It might have passed for an ordinary evening among partners, but Boon felt the weight of something unsaid pressing against the walls. It was Helena who finally spoke, her tone careful, carrying a gravity that shifted the room. "There's something else you need to know." Boon set down the coffee cup he'd been nursing, the bitter dregs gone cold. He had known this moment was coming. The sense of unfinished business had hung in every glance they'd exchanged all day. He steadied his voice. "Go on." Helena's gaze dropped to the table, her knuckles tightening. "Marcus didn't only betray us in promises. He'd left us bound to debts. Debts we didn't make, but debts in our name all the same." The words struck like a hammer blow. Boon's stomach sank, the air suddenly heavier. He wanted to curse Marcus aloud, to slam his fist into the table, but he forced his face steady. "What kind of debts?" Magdalene moved then, pulling a small ledger from the drawer beneath the mantel. She slapped it onto the table, her voice sharp with barely bridled anger. "Supplies he ordered from traders, equipment he bought on credit. He used our names, our reputation, to keep his schemes afloat. And when he fled, he left us, carrying the ledger." Ruth set the dried plate aside and folded the cloth neatly, her eyes downcast. "We've done what we can to keep the traders patient. Our work speaks for itself, but patience has limits. If we can't settle within the month, they'll turn and we'll lose everything we've built here." Boon reached for the ledger, his fingers brushing Magdalene's as he pulled it closer. He opened the worn cover, scanning the columns of figures written in Marcus's bold, careless hand. The numbers mounted quickly: supplies, tools, livestock exchanges. Enough to choke the farm if left unpaid. He closed the book slowly, his jaw set tight. "Damn him." The words slipped out rougher than he intended. "He didn't just run from you. He made sure the ruin followed." Magdalene's mouth twisted bitterly. "He was clever that way, charming enough to get what he wanted, coward enough to leave before the storm broke." Her green eyes flickered with anger and something close to shame. "We thought we'd seen every angle of him. We were wrong." Helena's shoulders sagged, the strength she carried all day faltering. "We didn't tell you before because we needed you to see what this place is, not just the chains tied to it." But you deserve to know the full truth before you choose." Boone leaned back, rubbing a hand over his face. He'd dreamed of cattle and quiet, of a life stripped of complication. Now here he sat with a ledger full of lies, 3 women bound by betrayal, and a choice he hadn't asked for pressing down like a millstone. Yet even as the weight of the numbers churned in his mind, he looked at them, the hard lines of Helena's face softened by exhaustion. Ruth's quiet steadiness even in the face of ruin. Magdalene's fire banked but still burning. They weren't broken. They'd been left in pieces, yes, but they had fitted themselves together with grit and defiance. And damn him. But Boone respected that. He tapped the ledger once with his finger. "These numbers aren't small, but they're not impossible either. Marcus left you with a curse, but he also left you with a farm that's worth something." More than something. Ruth's head lifted, her eyes searching his face, hope flickering like a candle nearly snuffed. "You think we can survive this?" Boone met her gaze. "I think you've already proved you can survive worse. This is only coin. The land pays back when you tend it right. You've shown me that." Magdalene looked away quickly, blinking against the shine in her eyes. Helena studied him, her expression unreadable at first. Then slowly, a crack appeared in her composure. Her lips pressed tight, and to Boone's surprise, tears welled, slipping down her cheeks despite her effort to hold them back. She turned her face, but her voice betrayed her. "We've carried this way too long." To hear someone say, "It can be managed," she broke off, swallowing hard. "It feels like standing in sunlight after months of shadow." Boone's chest tightened at the sight. He hadn't come here to be anyone's savior. But watching her strength falter, he felt something shift inside him. Something that made solitude feel less like safety and more like cowardice. He pushed the ledger back across the table, his tone firm. "If I'm to stand with you, it won't be as another Marcus. It'll be clear, fair, and honest. And these debts, we'll face them head on, together, not hidden in corners, not passed off to the next fool." The words settled heavy but steady, like stones laid for a foundation. Helena wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, meeting his gaze. For the first time since his arrival, her smile was genuine, small and trembling, but real. Ruth's lips curved into quiet gratitude. Magdalene gave the faintest nod, her fire tempered by relief. Boone leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. The future still looked uncertain, but one truth stood clear. Marcus Vance's shadow no longer felt like theirs alone to bear. It rested on him now too, and strangely, he didn't flinch beneath it. The ledger still lay on the table, its weight like an anvil, even with the lamp casting gentle light across its pages. Boone sat back, arms folded, studying the 3 women who watched him with a mixture of hope, fear, and defiance. He saw in them the strength of survival, but also the cracks Marcus Vance had left behind, cracks that could splinter again if the wrong man took hold. He cleared his throat, the sound rough in the silence. "If I stay, if I take this on, it won't be as Marcus did. No false promises, no clever wording to trap any of us. It'll be a partnership, clear, legal, binding in the way that matters." Helena leaned forward, her blue eyes steady but searching. "What does that mean to you?" Boone rested a hand on the ledger. "It means the debts come first. I've coin from selling my last holdings, enough to settle what's owed and give us breathing room. But it won't be a gift. It'll be an investment into all of us, into this land. Every decision after that, every choice we make together. No one carries the weight alone." Magdalene's lips parted, ready to argue, but she stopped herself. She leaned back against the mantel, eyes narrowing, not with anger but consideration. And the rest? You saw what Marcus promised. You saw what he left us expecting. Boone nodded slowly, choosing his words with care. The rest will come as it comes. No pressure, no demands. We let it grow if it wants to grow. And if it doesn't, then we stand as partners still. That's the only way I'll agree. The fire in Magdalene's green eyes softened just slightly, like embers banked under ash. Ruth, quiet until now, laid her folded cloth on the table, her hands stilling over it. Yeah? You mean we take time? To see what shape this might take, Boone met her gaze, holding steady. Yes, you've been through betrayal. I've carried loss. None of us needs another set of chains disguised as promises. What we need is choice. Helena exhaled, long and unsteady, the tension in her frame loosening, as if his words had pried open a locked door. Choice, she repeated, tasting it like it was rare. Marcus never gave us that. He charmed, he coaxed, he demanded, but he never asked. Always assumed, then I won't assume, Boone said simply. The room settled into quiet again, the only sound the low crackle of the fire. For the first time since he'd arrived, the silence wasn't suffocating. It felt like ground leveled after a storm, ready for something new to be built. Magdalene pushed off from the mantel, coming closer. She placed her hands flat on the table, her voice low but steady. If we draw these papers, it makes us all equal in the eyes of the law. Equal in work, equal in gain. You're sure of that? Boone gave a short nod. Equal in every way. No tricks. Ruth's face softened into something he hadn't seen before, quiet gratitude mixed with the cautious light of hope. Helena's lips curved, not into a smile exactly, but into the shadow of one, fragile and trembling but real. Magdalene studied him, eyes sharp, but at last she nodded too. Well, then maybe, she said. You're not the fool we thought you'd be. Boone allowed himself the faintest smile. I've been called worse. The moment broke some of the heaviness. Ruth chuckled softly. Helena leaned back in her chair with a tired sigh, and Magdalene's mouth twitched as if she fought a smile of her own. For the first time, Boone felt the tension in his shoulders ease. Still, he knew this wasn't finished. He tapped the ledger once more. These debts, we settle them first thing. Traders need to see we're serious. Once the accounts are clear, we draft partnership papers. I've a friend in town who can witness them proper. That way no one walks away carrying more than their share. Helena nodded, her expression sharpening back into business. Then it's settled. Debts, then papers. She leaned forward, her voice lowering. And after that, we see if the rest comes. Boone held her gaze, and for a heartbeat, the air between them hummed with unspoken possibility. He looked away first, clearing his throat. That's all I can promise. But it's a damn sight more than Marcus ever did. Ruth's voice came soft, warm. It's enough. The fire burned low, the lamplight flickering across four faces, bound now by more than suspicion. Something new had begun, fragile but real, drawn not by charm or coercion, but by the steady weight of choice. Boone rose, stretching the stiffness from his back. We'll ride into town tomorrow, he said. Settle with the traders. Start clean. Magdalene's eyebrow lifted. And if they don't take kindly to seeing another man in Marcus's place? Boone's jaw set, his voice firm. Then they'll learn quick I'm not Marcus. And neither are you three. We'll stand together. The words hung strong in the air. None of them spoke, but the look they shared said enough. For the first time since Marcus fled, They weren't three abandoned women clinging to survival. They were partners on the edge of something new. Boone stepped to the door, glancing back at the hearth, the table. The women who had turned his simple dream of solitude into a tangled web of danger, promise, and unexpected hope. His chest felt heavier, but not with dread, with possibility. 3 months later, the farmyard no longer looked like the place Boone had first ridden into. The fences stretched farther now, straight and strong, their lines cutting neat against the horizon. The herd had grown sleek and steady, their hides shining under the sun. Fresh timbers had gone up on the barn, its roof patched, its beams reinforced. Even the soil in the garden plots bore signs of life. Green rose sprouting where once there had been only dust. But the greatest change was not in the wood or earth. It was in the rhythm of 4 people who had learned to work and live as one. Boone stood in the yard one morning, hands resting on the haft of a post he'd just driven into place. Sweat streaked his back, dust caked his boots, and yet he felt lighter than he had in years. Helena came up beside him, carrying a bucket as though it weighed nothing, her hair damp from the creek. She glanced at the line of new fence and gave a short nod. "Straight," she said simply. "Solid." Her words were not flattery, but they landed on him like praise all the same. He'd come to understand Helena's language, few words measured, but each one heavy with meaning. In the evenings, when she allowed her guard to fall, she had become his closest confidant. She spoke with him about trade, about expansion, about strategies that carried more vision than he'd thought possible from a ranch in the wilderness. And sometimes, when the work was done and the others had gone to bed, her hand would find his across the table, rough and steady, needing no words at all. Ruth came next, leading a calf that resisted her rope with stubborn kicks. She soothed it with low words, her calm presence taming its fight. When she caught Boone's eye, she smiled, a quiet thing that spread warmth through his chest. Ruth had become the balance in their household, the steady current that kept tempers from clashing and plans from unraveling. She had shown him more about patience than any man or preacher ever had. And when he worked beside her, in the garden or by the irrigation channels, silence between them was never empty. It was companionable, whole. Magdalene arrived last, her red hair catching fire in the morning sun, as she strode across the yard with a basket of eggs tucked under one arm. She looked at the calf Ruth had calmed, then at Boone, her mouth twitching into that crooked grin that carried both challenge and affection. "Fence is straight, I'll give you that," she said, "but we'll see if it holds after the first storm." Her words carried no venom anymore, only the teasing of someone who had finally let down her guard. Magdalene had been the slowest to yield, her heart a fortress built of scars. But one morning weeks ago, while mending a stretch of broken fence, she had kissed him. Quick, fierce, unplanned. Since then, her fire had become less a shield and more a light that burned through the shadows Marcus had left behind. They had all chosen him, just as he had chosen them. Not in a single moment, not in the signing of papers or the paying of debts, but in the quiet accumulation of days shared, meals eaten side by side, burdens lifted together, nights spent beneath the same roof. The partnership papers had been drawn and signed, witness proper in town. Debts were paid, trade restored. The farm operated clean now, in the black, with profits reinvested in livestock, seed, and tools. But it was not the ink on the paper that bound them. It was the way they looked at one another at day's end, weary but certain they belonged. That evening they gathered on the porch for supper. The table stretched longer now, built by Boon and Helena from fresh timber to hold more than four. The horizon blazed with sunset, painting the sky in reds and golds. Ruth poured coffee. Magdalene passed bread. Helena leaned back in her chair with her boots propped against the rail. Boon looked at them, these three women who had turned his life inside out. He remembered the first day, their cold stares, the threats, the way fear had clawed at his gut. And he remembered the moment he saw past all that, glimpsing the hurt and loneliness beneath. It seemed impossible that what began in tension had led here, to this porch, to this laughter, to this sense of belonging that filled him more than any dream of solitude ever had. Helena broke the quiet, her voice thoughtful. "Any regrets, Whitmore?" Boon let his gaze travel across the fields, the herd, the farmhouse glowing warm in the fading light. He thought of the man he'd been when he arrived, clutching a deed like a shield, believing silence would heal what loss had hollowed out. Then he looked at the women who had shown him another way. "Only one," he said. They all turned to him, waiting. "I regret that Marcus Vance's betrayal is what brought us together. We could have had this sooner." For a heartbeat, silence reigned. Then Magdalene laughed, bright and unguarded. Ruth's smile deepened, her eyes soft. Helena shook her head, but her lips curved, rare and genuine. Their laughter carried across the yard, across the fences, into the gathering dusk. Boon leaned back, the sound filling the spaces that solitude once held. See, in a world that demanded conformity, they had chosen connection. In a society that preached convention, they had written their own definition of love. And for the first time in years, Boon Whitmore no longer felt like a man chasing silence. He felt like a man who had found his family